If most of this year's growth and revenue comes from one person or one person's relationships, that's not a growth system. It's essentially a really scary growth issue that just has someone's name on it. So I want to ask you something a COO should be able to answer, but most can't. We work with majority COOs, sometimes CEOs or directors, that kind of thing. So it's someone who is somewhat in charge of the commercial strategy of a company, right? And the question is, how much of this year's revenue can you trace back to one person? Most people, off the top of their head, maybe they have a feeling, but most people can't really answer that question. And you can't trace it back to one team. You can't trace it back to one process. It's one person, either a top salesperson, a single referral relationship, or even the CEO's network, which at a certain point you typically don't see as much. But for a lot of companies, the honest answer is that, the majority of, especially small middle market companies, the majority of our growth and our growth story has come from a single person. Again, whether that is a referral partner, the CEO, or maybe a really good salesperson. And today we're talking about what it means when the system is actually just one or maybe two people. What it costs you and what it takes to build something that you can live on if they're no longer around. Hello, everyone. This is Unearth with Shelly Hughes. I'm Shelly Hughes. In this podcast, we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of building a passionate, profitable business. Everything we talk about comes directly from client case studies, things we work with clients all the time in the revenue and growth terms. So everything in here is very applicable, especially if you're one of those middle market individuals on kind of the commercial strategy, sales, operational level. So let's get started. I want to remind you, this is episode number 2 of the Growth Engine series. Last episode 78, we talked about the invisible pipeline. And so if you weren't able to listen to that, that's a pretty good one. This episode goes a little bit deeper into what that can look like, but this one is a little bit more specific about what happens and how to realize and how to just not ignore when most of your revenue comes from one person. So what it means when one person is the system. You're most likely a middle market company if you're listening to this. Most likely you might have a founder, but at this point, there's probably not founder dependence. You've matured out of that. A lot of small companies, they have the same issue, but it is founder dependence. Once you get to a certain point, you really are able to graduate from that, but it doesn't mean that your growth story isn't dependent on an individual and not actually a system. And so from the COO seat, which again, usually is who we talk to, either the director of operations, the CEO, sometimes a VP of sales, like I said, it can look like one of 3 patterns. One salesperson closes a disproportionate amount of revenue, and that forecast is just, what does she have in her pipeline this month? When you're looking at your forecast, you automatically think about that one salesperson and what she has in her pipeline. Second one is maybe one referral relationship or one partner quietly accounts for a huge percentage of new business. And no one has ever exactly mapped out this much. This happened with a partner of ours. They grew to probably about a $20 million business just from one referral partner. And this guy, he would fly all over the country, all over the world. When he get the call saying, hey, I need you at this meeting, he would fly there, get the business, and not have to think twice about it. He grew to $20 million. But a question we always ask clients is, how predictable is your revenue? And it's a really tough question to answer, right? Because if this person stays, or if that partner stays, that referral partner stays, you could arguably say your revenue is rather predictable. But if something happens in that relationship, if God forbid there's a lawsuit, if they sell their business, if they get a new CEO or whatever it looks like, then what happens to your growth? It probably shatters because there's no real engine behind it that's not solely dependent, right? And we think about this too with clients. We talk about diversifying our clients. We have to diversify how we get revenue and how we get leads and how we get lead gen, because if that one thing doesn't work anymore, then the entire system is going to collapse. So one could be one salesperson does a disproportionate amount of sales. One is one referral relationship or partner that brings in the most of your money. And the third is maybe the CEO's personal network or the CEO's credibility is still the thing opening doors years after the company stopped being a two-person startup or something like that. And all three have the same pattern. No one can deny that revenue is real, but it's concentrated in a relationship and not distributed across a system. Let's be real. There's always going to be a strong suit. There's always going to be someone, and maybe it's a CEO, maybe it's someone else that really does a really good job at what they do, right? Numbers don't lie. But what I want to challenge you today is really to diagnose if you have this, I'm going to call it an issue, because again, if that one person leaves, I don't want your business crumbling to the ground because I've seen it happen before. And that's when panic happens. But I want to talk about why this happens and really why it's not necessarily a mistake right off the bat. But before we talk about risk, let's talk about why this is so common. Especially when a lot of times we work with companies that have an amazing growth story, but they don't really have a growth strategy. And what a growth story is, it really does a lot of times involve relationships. And relationships are the fastest, cheapest way to generate revenue, especially in the early years. And no system beats a warm introduction. So I would never say, especially if you're B2B, which again is most of the clients that we serve, actually 100% of the clients that we serve at this point, the relationships are always going to be part of your business development. But the person carrying that relationship, we have to realize, is genuinely excellent at what they do. They're really good at making that relationship, at being personable, about giving. They're not a shark that's just going after business development. So this isn't a performance problem in any way. It's actually the opposite. Most companies don't choose this concentration on purpose. It's just what happens when growth outpaces the systems that were meant to build it. And so the COO, whoever we talk to, they don't create this pattern intentionally. It's usually just inherited about how the company got there. And again, this is why we work a lot with companies who had an amazing growth story, but they really don't have a growth strategy. They don't have a growth engine. And that's what this is episode 2 in the series talk is all about. So like I said, this doesn't show up as a crisis, typically. It shows up as a slow erosion of forecasting confidence. And so what is forecasting, right? If we can know that this is how many leads we typically bring in per month, this is our rate to close, and this is our cost per close, we can pretty easily forecast based on past months. Maybe look at this time last year if you're in more of a seasonal. That's how you forecast. But the challenge comes if you can't give leadership a reliable forecast, because so much of it depends on that one or two people, what they're personally carrying each month. That can be a real issue. So if that top performer or the referral partner or the CEO, their own relationship cooled off tomorrow, no one could tell you with confidence how much revenue is actually at risk. If you're not really looking at this as a potential challenge, that you're not going to fire that person, you're not going to get rid of that person because they're obviously incredibly good at what they do, but we do something at our company at Nolia Roots. We're a revenue and growth firm where it's ABCD, always be collecting dots. We took it from Danny Myers from the book Setting the Table, amazing book about hospitality and how we should all be using elements of hospitality in our businesses. And we say, okay, what are those things in the back of our mind that just make us go, that's a little odd, or that person's tone was off? Because I feel like so many people, it's so easy to just ignore it. Whether it's you don't want to have a hard conversation or you don't have time to think about it. So a lot of what we do internally is that ABCD, always be collecting dots. And sometimes as a COO or a VP of sales or something like that, whoever owns a commercial system, if anyone owns a commercial system, which by the way, in most of our clients, no one actually quote unquote owns it, they have this thing in the back of their mind of this guy, Henry, is closing all of our sales and Sheena and Patrick are like doing okay, but I really don't want Henry to leave. And that's a really scary place for someone to be in. As a leader, you have different theories about keeping people or letting them go. You have the old Jeff Bezos style where he fires people after 3 years, right? Just because he realizes that you're going to be complacent and after 3 years, it's just not worth keeping you, right? I have also heard in the past, you shouldn't just expect people on your team to leave. You should want them to leave. And honestly, I've experienced that with myself. Every time someone has left the company, even if they're pretty darn good at their job, whoever replaced them usually just levels it up a little bit. And I think in that, you as a hiring manager, if as a CEO, that's what you want to hold on to, I think when CEOs are really intentional about hiring and they're involved in hiring, I think the hiring process goes so much better. Your team is so much stronger. If that's a strength of yours or an interest of yours, of course. So you have this one side of the entrepreneurial thought process that says, hey, you don't just want people to leave. You don't just expect people to leave. You want them to leave. But then there's an other side of how can I keep you as long as physically possible, right? And when you have that mentality, in my mind, sometimes it's a very scarce mentality, right? I've had old bosses come to me crying, asking me never to leave them. And it's just made me feel a little off, right? So that has never really been how I feel. However, from a logical and operational perspective and time and investment perspective, hell yeah, you want to keep as many people as you can because you put so much investment into them in learning and trust and development and all these different things. They know how everything works. And by the way, they're really freaking good at what they do. So if you do want to take that mindset, realize it might be slightly a scarcity mindset, a little bit. It takes a lot of work to hire. You never know what you're going to get, really. But if you want to take that mindset and you want to keep these people on, you have to figure out how to incentivize them based on what they value, right? And that can be a whole other conversation that we're not going to get into today. But the moment it becomes a COO's problem or the VP of sales problem is if that person, here's the thing, if they are the one that has all the relationships, they're talking to a lot of people. I have gotten more job offers than I can count, right? Just because usually they're informal job offers. There's not actually a position open, but hey, you should come work for me type things. That's how people leave because they say, what would it be like to work over there? If this one person has that many relationships, they're probably somehow having those conversations as well because people realize they are incredible at what they do. So we can talk about incentivizing in another part, but that is really what happens when it turns into the director of operations or the CEO problem. So the board conversations in your due diligence. So you always have to ask the question, what happens when this person leaves? Because that person will leave. And Alex Hormozy was on Diary of a CEO podcast, I don't know, a couple weeks ago. And he asked the question, like, what do you need to stay with us forever, right? He's in that mindset of keep the good people, which I get. What needs to happen for you to stay with us forever? So you could ask that question because usually if that one person leaves, there's really no good answer. New hires typically, even if they're new, can't replicate the result because what's driving was never built into a repeatable process. It lives in one person's relationships and one person's instincts. And the most dangerous version of this is when revenue looks fine up until the moment it doesn't. And by then, it's way too late because the system should have been built 6 months ago. This happened to a client. It was actually a founder company. They're a middle market company. And pretty much every single relationship was because of the founder. And let me tell you, when we brought this client, usually we don't have founder clients, but I really like working with founders because I'm a founder myself. And he met every other kind of checkbox. But when we started talking, I was like, man, you sound exhausted. He's like, I am. And it was because he was basically in charge of personnel, even though he had an HR person. He was in charge of sales, even though he had an assistant that can help in sales. He was in charge of all these different things. He was doing everything because honestly, he was the best at it. And that could be the reason he didn't, for whatever reason, he didn't give it to someone else. But that's when we realized that when there's such a concentration on sales, it really can turn into a huge issue because was that person the most healthy person in the world? No. What happens if that person has a heart attack? What happens if you get on the head? What happens if you get hurt, right? You can't continue to do those things. So that was just a quick example and a quick aha moment that we had of, this is a jarring example of exactly what we're talking about here. So let's talk about building the system instead of relying on the person. So it isn't about replacing a great salesperson. Again, incentivize the hell out of them, right? Or ending a great partnership. It's about making sure the company isn't structurally dependent on either one. And so start with the diagnosis, right? Map exactly. We do this with every client starting out. We go through the past 18 and 24 months of brand new clients, and we map out exactly who brought them in, or what was that first interaction look like? What was their industry? How many employees are they? Who did you talk to? But when you do this, you can map how much of this year's revenue traces back to a single person or a single relationship. It's an amazing exercise that we do with clients. And most companies, from our experience, have never calculated this. They might have an idea, and sometimes it's a surprise, and sometimes it's not a surprise. They already knew something was up. And so separate the relationship from the judgment, right? What is it that the top performer is actually doing that's producing results? And can any of it be taught? Can any of it be documented? Can any of it be shared? What kind of personality traits does this person have that we can filter out applicants in the future to have more of those personality traits? For me, if I were to ever recommend hiring a salesperson, here's the thing. I'm not hiring a minimalist salesperson. I'm not hiring a guy that, he drives like a Honda Civic and he's comfortable with his life. He doesn't wear a pinky ring, right? I'm hiring the shark who wants to drive a Lamborghini, has a freaking nice suit, because he's living his life at a level that he wants his income to keep up with, to help keep up with, right? And so maybe that, whether said or unsaid, is an attribute to one of your top salespeople. So how do you find more of those people, right? Again, you can't judge a book by its cover all the time, but you have an idea of what the book's about. So I'll leave it at that. So how much of it can be taught, documented, or shared? What should be some of those line items that we want to look for in new people that we hire? And formalize what's informal, right? A referral partner who's carrying real revenue deserves a real structure, not just a standing favor, right? So what does that relationship look like, and how can you build more relationships? If you get most of your business from this one business coach, for example, that refers you all of his clients or whatever that looks like, find more business coaches. Or you can do the same thing. If the CFO, if you're getting most of your referrals from a CFO or maybe a wealth advisor or something like that, make more relationship with the wealth advisors. Go to the trade show full of wealth advisors and make more relationships there. So you're not just reliant on one or two people within that sphere, right? And here's the thing that I think a lot of people miss. When there's not someone responsible for taking ownership in the commercial strategy and the commercial and revenue system. And this is what we do as fractional chief revenue officer, is someone who has to own tracking and deliberately reducing this concentration over time. And because if it gets left alone, it's never going to fix itself and it is going to become a problem. So it's precisely the kind of gap that we jump into all the time, because again, a lot of people don't have someone in the company that is able to own that as a position. This is episode 2 of the growth system, all about reliance on one person. The system is based on one person. The growth system is based on one person. Next week, I want to talk about what it actually costs to get a new client, the real number behind how you get new business, and why most companies really have never calculated it to the extent that it should. And what does it cost per customer acquisition? How much does it really cost you versus how much you are charging for a customer within the customer's lifetime? And we'll kind of get an idea on what a healthy ratio is there. So that's going to be next week. But to finish this one out, a company built on one person's relationships, here's the thing, it isn't broken. You've had an amazing growth story. It's just really unfinished. And the work isn't taking away from that person that was able to help build it. It's making sure the company's growth doesn't quietly depend on if that one person stays or not. And that's exactly what this series is for. Thank you. I appreciate your time. I hope this was really helpful. If you thought this was helpful, please give this podcast a follow, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, do all the things, send this to someone that you think would benefit from. And I'll see you next week when we talk about what it actually costs to get a client. We'll go through a lot of that calculation. Thanks. I see it and you see it. Your revenue is real, but it's concentrated on a person and not distributed across a system, and that's where you're going to get in trouble. The most dangerous part of what we're talking about today is when revenue looks absolutely fine till the moment it doesn't.